one of my favorite sayings I've ever heard. I don't know who said this, but this place started going to shit 15 minutes after I got here.
This is A New Angle, and I'm your host, Justin Angle, marketing professor at the University of Montana College of Business. This podcast is my chance to speak with cool people doing awesome things in and around the great state of Montana. We are proudly underwritten by First Security Bank and Blackfoot. Hey folks, welcome back, and thanks for tuning in. Today I speak with Brendan Leonard, the man behind SEMI-RAD. I started following Brendan's SEMI-RAD feed on Instagram several years ago. It's got a playful sensibility and an uncanny knack for making you consider the ordinary or obvious from a different perspective. It's really one of my favorite things. I connected with Brendan through some mutual friends after learning of his recent move back to Missoula. Happy to have him in our community, and I'm happy for you to learn more about Brendan's work right now. Okay, so you're here today with Brendan Leonard. Brendan, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Otherwise known as SEMI-RAD, that was my entry point to your work a couple of years ago, and it's been super fun learning that you are now a member of the Missoula community, or a yet again member of the Missoula community. This is not your first time around here. Yeah, let's start there. What was your first entry point to Montana? I know it's played a significant role in your life.
Yeah, boy, I'd grown up in Iowa and gone to college there, and barely graduated in 2001, and then had a series of I was basically my introduction to Montana. The summer before I came here, I went to rehab for substance abuse for 5 weeks, spent a week in jail, and then moved to Missoula to go to grad school to get a master's degree in journalism.
And so were your problems with alcohol sort of like through college thing, or like how did that kind of get to the point where you had to kind of get some help?
Well, I think in addiction circles, they often describe it as first you have fun and then you have fun with problems and then you just have problems. And I went through the whole cycle pretty quickly. So I started drinking when I was 15 in my small town in rural Iowa. And then, just had a lot of fun really quickly. And by the time I was 21, things started going sort of wrong for me. And I was the only one having problems when we went out at night. And I feel like I was lucky to survive that part and lucky to have not really caused a ton of incredible damage to other people. Not that there wasn't some of that, but kind of just finally got arrested enough times that the state said, you go to rehab or you go to jail for 6 months. And
so the choice had been kind of taken out of your hands in some ways.
Yeah, which felt unfair at the time. And I felt like, gosh, I'm too young for this, blah, 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 all these things that I reasons I could think of that I shouldn't have to do it. And in retrospect, it's one of the best things that ever happened to me. So yeah. It was tough. It was really tough in the early years, but it was definitely better than 6 months in jail. I think, I don't know. I haven't done 6 months in jail, but I assume it's not a super party. So
yeah, I mean, I doubt either's a super pleasant option. You're choosing kind of between two difficult things, but yeah, getting sober, getting cleaned up, and then kind of getting some direction, moving out here to Montana was the next step.
Yeah, so I got a marketing degree in undergrad, but the final year of it, I was kind of not sure I wanted to do any of the jobs that I was seeing that I might be able to get when I graduated, and saw an ad in the student newspaper and started writing a column for the student newspaper. Humor, just really, I'm really glad that stuff's not on the internet because it's some really dumb, awful stuff, but it sort of, so once a week column, and I would write whatever I wanted. And, by halfway through the year, people would sort of every once in a while stop me on campus or at the bar and say, hey, I read your thing. That was super funny. Or they liked it in some way. So it was this beginning of getting feedback for a newspaper column. And I thought, oh, columnist, that's like a job, and I didn't know that wasn't a full-time job, that no newspaper was paying someone to write one column a week, and giving you $60,000 a year for that. But it kind of got me interested in journalism. And Montana was one of the grad programs I found that took people who didn't have an undergrad in journalism.
Yeah.
So, and I don't remember at the time, this is like 2001, 2002. I don't remember thinking much about that it was in Montana or any of the other reasons people would move to Montana, like mountains and beautiful scenery and the culture and everything. I just remember thinking, well, this will work. And I think I applied to 4 places and got into 2 of them and chose Montana and was like, okay, let's try it.
Yeah. And then you got here and seems like the mountains grabbed you pretty quickly.
Yeah. So I was like, let's see, March. I was probably about a little over 5 months into sobriety. So I was smoking a pack of cigarettes every day.
Oh, geez.
Yeah. I mean, this was like one of these things that you think, well, that is helping you hang on to, by that thread. So, but I had, met a couple people who took me just sort of on day hikes, down in the Bitterroot or on Mount Sentinel, and one backpacking trip up to Glacier. I never backpacked before. We spent one night, 4 of us in a 3-person tent, and woke up, hiked up the top of, I think, Swift Current Lookout, and the view up there. I saw a photo of myself. This was 2000, like October 2002, I think, and it just blew my mind. And I think it was this thing, something clicked where it was like I had spent the last 5 months not knowing who I was or what I should do next, because you build this whole identity around sort of partying and or whatever that is. And I realized, like, well, this is something, going out into the mountains is something people do every weekend. Maybe I could do more of this. And it just sort of started to snowball from there.
And I would think too, like that first glacier trip or these first few trips into the mountains, particularly when you're smoking a pack of cigarettes a day or whatever, it can't like feel all that good physically. Although at that point you probably don't know what feeling good physically is. Yeah. And then, there's probably this self-reinforcing thing where like you're starting to make better life choices. You feel better on these outings. It's just, it kind of snowballs. You can do more stuff. You can go for longer. Yeah, I could see how that could be very positively reinforcing over time pretty quickly.
Yeah, I think of it as like, when you start out, you're like literally, I think that trip I definitely wore jeans and like probably I think I had like a cotton long sleeve t-shirt on. So you're wearing all cotton in the mountains. And I don't know if I even had hiking boots. But if you don't know there's better gear, you're not that uncomfortable. You're just like, oh. But then later you think, you start to get things that are comfortable and make things easier. And you realize how hard it was when you were wearing jeans and had a horrible backpack and a big heavy sleeping bag. So I think the same way physically, but yeah, slippery slopes. You're right. I'm eating vegetables and all that crazy stuff. So
making good life choices, all those things, and
kale.
starting to get some formal training in journalism and starting to do your own writing. And so how does that kind of career in creative essentially start to kind of come to life?
Yeah. I mean, when at the time I was there, and I would assume it still is, I think, the journalism school is like, I think the ideal that you go in there with is like if you graduated and worked for the Washington Post, that's a good outcome. Like that's the ideal outcome. And I think when I was there, I was learning all these things and learning how to do, because they do such a great job of teaching, putting you in a position where you could do that. So I get this incredible foundation of basics of editing, design, reporting, all this stuff. And, that would have been a great thing to do, to go work for a major market newspaper. But I don't know that I really wanted to do that. And I think in my mind, when I started here, I thought I'd love to work for or write for like Rolling Stone or Spin Magazine at some point. And then I took a magazine writing class my second semester of my second year. So right before I graduated, and the requirement for grad students is that it was basically yeah, undergrad students than a handful of grad students. But if you were a grad student, you had to get published in order to pass the class.
Okay. Wow.
So I was like, oh my God, how am I going to get published in Rolling Stone magazine? And I'm like just this lowly, my publishing credits are like the Montana Kaimin and, almost nothing else. And a classmate said, you should try to write for Idaho Magazine. They pay like $40 per article and they take pretty much anything. And I said, oh, okay, great.
That sounds like a win.
Yeah. So I had done a little road trip the previous summer where a friend and I visited Hemingway's grave in Ketchum, went to Craters of the Moon National Monument, and climbed Bora Peak, the highest mountain in Idaho, which was way beyond my fitness and skill level. But we did it, and I pitched them the story, and they said, sure, well, that sounds great. We'll take it. Looks like your friend took some photos. Why don't you send us those? And I got published, and I got my $40. And that just a light bulb went on, and it was like, wow, I could, make a sort of a living writing about adventures or these things that I do outdoors on the weekends. And, my brain didn't do the math and go, okay, $40 per article. How many articles is that to make a living? It's quite a lot. So I think my first year freelance income was $40. The next year was like $150, and the next year was like $1,800 or something like that. So I left Montana in 2004, and I worked at a couple different really small suburban newspapers that I don't know if anyone was actually reading them over the next 5 years. And on the side, I would go to work every day and think, this is fine. I'm using my degree, but this is not what I want to do. I want to write for Outside Magazine and Backpacker and climbing, because I was getting into rock climbing at that time. And so I would write pitch letters, and try to come up with article ideas. And, overnight success story from 2004 to 2010-ish. I did not get into any of these major magazines, but I finally got something in Climbing Magazine, I think 2011. So it took me that many years to figure out a way in.
Yeah, a lot of grinding. Why did you, what made you stick with it? Because I've heard this origin story from a few different adventure writers. Mark Sinnott, his story of his experience at Middlebury College and in a similar class, and getting something published, and that the sort of the hook setting in at that moment, and he stuck with it too through a bunch of up and down. You stuck. To grind that out for so long. One, there's just sort of how actually do you pull it off and sustain a life, but then, the sort of will to continue when,
right.
You're getting a ton of rejection and you're not making much money. Yeah. Why'd you stick with it?
You hear early on about, stories like very famous books that have been rejected over 100 times, like Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, which has sold millions of copies, was rejected over 100 times. And it becomes this sort of badge of honor, American dream, Olympic hopeful story that we are such big fans of, against all odds. And so I think there's probably some romanticism in there, but
sure.
Also you just want to do it. And along the way I was eventually getting smaller successes, where I started to get articles published in the Mountain Gazette, if you remember that magazine, which is coming back, I guess, this year. So it wasn't Backpacker, but it was a cool magazine that I respected, and it was very legitimate for me to have that in there. But yeah, I don't know. I've always been a work harder, not smarter person, and
sure.
An easier way in would be to, have studied more and gone to the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern, and then, interned at Outside Magazine or something like that, or network or whatever. And I didn't. I just was I'm just going to keep writing until something happens. And eventually things started to happen, but it was very slow for me. And I think that's maybe good, because then when you're making mistakes early on, they're in front of a small audience and no one knows who you are, as opposed to your first stories being published in the New York Times, which
sure.
probably doesn't happen to very many people. But
well, yeah, along those lines, could you feel yourself getting better as you were moving through this process? Getting some external validation, getting into better outlets closer to the space you want to be in.
Yeah.
But can you feel yourself getting better as a creator, as a writer?
I don't know. I think if you go to work and you think you're congratulating yourself, it's probably a bad way to start.
Yeah,
So from no
totally.
matter what point in your career. But 2011, I had collected a healthy amount of rejection letters and was getting really good at pitching things to magazines that they didn't want to run. So I just started my own blog, February 2011, and was like, I'll just put stories that I think are funny or that I can make something out of on here. And I'm going to do one of these every week for, I don't know, a year or until something happens. And um, it was good timing. And within a few weeks, maybe like 2 or 3 months, I started seeing the traffic go up a little bit, like not a huge amount. Like it wasn't like a mega viral post, but it was like there were people reading it, people were commenting, people were sort of sharing things on Facebook or Twitter or whatever. And it was validation that you're kind of figuring out what people were responding to.
Right. Yeah. You have some sort of, however, maybe it's intuitive, maybe it's analytical, but you have some data starting to come in where you can sort of say, oh, yeah, these sorts of things people like, they engage with. Yeah,
Yeah,
that can be kind of guiding as well.
basically, yeah. And then a few months into the blog, I had Steve Casimiro, who started and has run Adventure Journal for over a decade now. He reached out through a friend and said, "Hey, I like some of your stuff that you're putting on your blog. What do you think about me also publishing it on my website, Adventure Journal, and I'll link back to your blog?" So that was a huge validation because he
Yeah.
was, founding editor of Bike Magazine, editor of Powder, National Geographic Adventure. So that made me think, okay, I am kind of doing something right. And in turn, having him publish my stuff led a lot of people to my work. So it sort of was this big hand up from somebody who was very established. And not to toot my own horn, but I think Steve has like really good taste, not just me, but like the
Sure.
way he does things. So that was extremely huge for me, and I owe him, a good chunk of my life for doing that.
And so speaking of your blog, SEMI-RAD, I was scrolling through your 100 favorite things or 100 things, and I scrolled to the bottom because I was thinking this guy's got to like XKCD, and yeah, XKCD is number 100. It's when I first came across your Instagram posts and the charts that you produce, the two have some similarities that are striking. And yeah, talk about when you first started doing those visuals. And I'd love to kind of understand how those ideas come to life.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing I did was probably in like 2014. I did a flow chart about, gosh, now I don't remember which one. There was one that was called, "Is There a Cute Girl at the Climbing Gym?" And it was basically making fun of male sort of peacocking, but it was like this instruction manual, like, is she looking at you? Okay, we'll do this. Is she looking at you? No. So, okay, do this. Did you take your shirt off? Are you grunting loudly or whatever? And that sort of went really viral for me, not a huge, not breaking the internet, but like really went around. And I was like, it was just something I drew on literally a sheet of printer paper in a coffee shop and then took a photo of and posted it. And so that kind of illustrated to me the idea that you could make these things that people, it wasn't a lot of work for people to read it. And it was a joke or sort of a story about humans. And people liked them and liked to share them. And it was easier for a lot of people than getting into like a 1,200 word blog entry or whatever. So I started doing those, and then I started drawing stuff on Instagram, on like little sheets of graph paper or whatever, just sort of simpler charts that were squares. And in 2016, I decided to buy an iPad to make it sort of more professional. And then, like, I don't know if I thought this at the time, but like if you have a digital image, you can actually do something with it as opposed to a photo of something drawn on graph paper. Like,
sure, now it's an asset all of a sudden.
You can make a poster or a t-shirt or a coffee mug or something like that. So I started doing that, and that sort of that iPad is probably one of the best $1,200 purchases I've ever made because of that.
And so the format has great utility. And you mentioned sort of, yeah, it's easier for somebody to get into and quickly kind of consume and get versus a 1,200 word blog post. But at the same time, like to make a good one, one, there's sort of the observation of something that you decide is interesting and you want to communicate. But to get it right, I mean, there's a ton happening in your posts that, tell us about the process of sort of working, observing an idea like the thing in the climbing gym and then actually making it happen. I'm sure some of them happen like super quick and then others are maybe a grind.
Yeah, and some of them don't do very well, and like a very small handful of them do really well and go around the internet or whatever. Yeah, I don't know. I try to create a little bit of space in my life where I'm not looking at the internet or my phone or whatever, and oftentimes that's on long runs, long trail runs or runs around the city or just walking the dog. And I'll think of something and just have a note about it. If I have my phone with me, I'll type it into my phone. Just a few things like a note would be maybe running is so simple, jokes about why it's actually not simple. And then later I'll come back and sit down and try to draw it, or I'll write a lot of, I guess I approach it mostly as a writer because everything I do has words in it because I can't draw very well. So it's more of like a sort of visual story, I guess. So there's a lot of writing in it. And then I'll sit down and try to draw the thing and make sure it looks as good or as clear as I can do it, and make it as simple as possible for people to understand. Because, I mean, there are tons of different ways you can actually visualize data, but very few of them are understood by adults who are not taking like college classes in that subject. So you can't really make things too complicated, I've learned. And the more complicated things are, the worse they'll do sometimes.
A New Angle is brought to you by First Security Bank and Blackfoot, two cool companies doing awesome things all over Montana.
Hey, this is Mark Moss from Tell Us Something, and you're listening to A New Angle.
And then basically I show it to my wife, who's also a writer and editor, and she will say, "Yeah, I think that'll work," or "Yeah, that's really funny." And then I'll say, "Okay, thank you," and then and put it online. So it's not an extremely scientific process, but yeah, she's the barrier between me and the world, and does, every once in a while put the kibosh on some things and be like, "Yeah, I don't know if you want to do that."
Right. Yeah. That's probably the best type of editor you could ask for.
Oh yeah. Yep.
Yeah. I was reading one of your blog posts. It mentioned, the privilege of leisure time and having leisure time and having time to, sort of the time and privilege really to get out in the mountains and do things with your body, et cetera. And privilege is a concept that I think is it's not necessarily taken on new meaning, but it's taken on new salience in the last several months. And ideas around leisure, ideas around conservation, ideas around access, those things. I think people are thinking about these things in a way they maybe hadn't thought of before.
Mm-hmm.
How have those thoughts, as one who sort of adventures and writes about those activities, be it your own activities or the activities of others, how have you kind of been grappling with this new salience right now?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting time to be trying to make art, and I think especially as a white straight guy, who I didn't grow up rich, but I did not grow up uncomfortable. Like I never once had to wonder where food was coming from. But I think if you have any sort of perspective, you have to, and I've been woken up. If you have any sort of perspective, you have to realize, that you are tremendously privileged, even things you don't think are privileged, which has been an education for me over the past couple of years too. Not only just to be able to freely go about trails, I can go running it at night, and maybe that's a situation where my wife and other women are not comfortable doing in a city or in a trail or whatever. Not to mention if you're a person of color in certain places in America or the world, how differently that affects you. And I also, I guess lately I'm thinking about it in the words of my friend Alex, who's the editor of Adventure Cyclist magazine. Does the world need to hear more from a 40-year-old white guy right now?
Right.
Yeah, so I don't, I try not to make so much. I'm trying to make art that is sort of universal to people who are in the outdoors, as opposed to just talking about my experience. Trying to lean that way for sure. And it's a tricky time to be trying to talk about social justice issues as well.
Right.
And to think about all the different angles in the way people who follow you might perceive something you say. And, even if you're trying to do the right thing, how that could be construed as the wrong thing, or you're leaving somebody out. And I've been very, very careful to try to not, step on toes and put that sort of messaging, or that sort of put that movement backwards by saying something that's ill-informed or whatever. So I've been I've had very limited sort of posts about that sort of thing, but also trying to carefully consider when I do and I wanted to say something and not, let's see, how would I say this? I guess when you put those sorts of things up, is it helping further conversation without alienating people, no matter what their beliefs are? I don't like to make things that further divide people,
Right.
especially
right.
now. So that's a thing to consider too. And I probably over consider the audience in many ways, and oftentimes end up not saying anything that's very pithy or meaningful. But yes, I think it's an important time, and considering the privilege that you have will help us all get closer together and help move things forward towards a better place for everyone. And some of the work I do is hosting a podcast, and we have made a very concerted effort this year to. In my head, I'm just going like, we're not interviewing white guys. We are two white guys on the podcast hosting it, and I'm like, we just need to not interview white guys for like 6 or 8 months. I don't want to be. Nothing against white guys. I am one, but there are so many other voices out there that need amplifying to talk about their experiences. So that's been a way around putting myself in front of a microscope, I guess, is allowing other people's voices, other people with other experiences, to talk about those and interview them, instead of saying, this is what I think, this is how I think things should be, or whatever.
Yeah, I think it is a challenge. I mean, I've thought about that and grappled with that with this podcast. Try to have diverse voices on as many dimensions as I can. And we need to do way better. And, we've been called out by various listeners, and ultimately, like, I see that as a compliment, in the sense that people are looking to the platform to weigh in on some of this stuff. And it is that tricky thing. Like, there's this sort of, hey, pump the brakes. The world doesn't need to hear from another white guy. But there's also the sort of, silence equals violence kind of framing as well. So it almost seems like anybody with a platform, there's a little bit of a responsibility to do something. It's just sort of, what is that something? Like, what can actually be meaningful? And I think there's also got to be space to sort of try and fail,
Yeah.
Like, hey, I tried and I didn't quite get it right. And as long as you sort of do it in good faith with humility, that hopefully your audience will give you a chance.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, it's a challenge. But things like, conservation, I had not really thought about it as like this white Eurocentric concept. And it certainly is one. And we go play in these public lands, and that's sort of a wacky social construction that white people created, right?
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, and you're now seeing people like acknowledging, the lands were, ancestral lands of Native American people and First Nation peoples in Canada, and that's helpful, I think. And I think it's very important to recognize that. But yeah, it's you're kind of going, oh, Yosemite National Park, like, oh wow, this isn't really okay. This is a
Yeah.
not. It's not like it was just created one day by white people. So yeah, all of that's interesting and messy, and is we're trying different things to promote healing, and but it's we have a long way to go, obviously. But I think I am um, I am hopeful because I think I see things happening that are leading us in that direction, as opposed to just ignoring it, to continuing to ignore it. I think about I read People's History of the United States when I was 20, I think,
Hmm.
sitting on the porch of a house in college, smoking cigarettes, reading, just being appalled by all these horrible things that had happened. But I think it took me, gosh, another like 19 years to start going, okay, what can I do? What can I actually do to put my money where my mouth is instead of just feeling bad? So working to do those things and do them the right way is definitely important, because I guess in the adventure industry, quote unquote, or the outdoor industry where I've worked, it is at some point, if you want to be cynical about it, you can say, geez, all I do is help, rich people go on vacation. And it
Hmm.
shouldn't be like that. It's like, yeah, if all you talk about is resort skiing and ice climbing, yeah, those are pretty, they're high barriers to entry in those sports. But a friend of ours pointed out that outside is not necessarily on top of a 14,000-foot peak or rock climbing. It can be a city park, and it can be people having a picnic, and that's true too. So I think about it in those terms as well. These like municipal parks and how great of a thing they are. We think conservation, we think national, like we think national parks, but really like Central Park in New York is a pretty amazing piece of conservation.
Yeah.
City
And the
Park in
good that
Denver,
does for so many people is immense.
it's very accessible. A lot of the city park system in Denver, where we used to live, was created because it was a place for basically the riffraff to go, while the rich people went up to the mountains, went up to Winter Park and South Park. And so they thought these city park systems will be where the lower class people can hang out. So that's why there's an extensive city park system there. But nowadays, it's a wonderful place for a lot of people. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. And then you think about this sort of continuum of the way people are engaging with the outdoors, and there's inspiration and aspiration, right? Like you see, I read your post about the Don Wall a few years back, and in many ways, like you think, yeah, that's this privileged activity of these elite athletes, but at the same time, if it inspires people to get out and expand their own realm of possibilities, whether it's at the city park or in their home gym or whatever, that's important too, and that has a lot of value.
oh for sure. I mean, that's the essence of inspiration to me. It's like, sure, we follow really high achieving athletes, but we don't sit down and go, okay, now I'm going to climb the Dawn Wall. You
Right,
do
right.
you do your own Dawn Wall, in Tommy Caldwell's words. I was
Hmm.
talking to my dad the other day, and he said, I am still working on cleaning out the garage. And I said, Dad, I think you've been working on cleaning out the garage for years. I believe the garage is your Dawn Wall at this point. Um,
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I have a Dawn Wall everywhere I look around this place.
exactly. Right.
Yeah. So let's sort of just pivot to, you came back to Missoula and came back over this past summer, and you talk about that decision, and then wow, moving in the midst of a pandemic and trying to re-enter or trying to enter a community under those conditions. That's got to be a pretty bizarre experience.
Yeah. I mean, for me, coming back here in the last 5 years and short visits was I have to work to separate, do I like the town, or do I just have extreme nostalgia for that time in my life when it was probably one of the hardest but most important times of my life. So it's a weird thing. I'm 41, and I often have to go, do I miss that, or do I just miss being young? So that was important, but we wanted some place where we could have just a little bit more space, because my wife and I were working out of 850 square foot half duplex in Denver. Yeah. And, there's the awareness of if you move to Montana, you are those people from Colorado who are moving to Missoula, and like you're going to be that person to somebody. Most of the people we talk to are not bad about that, but occasionally, you're talking to somebody at the DMV or
Well, and then right now, like with COVID, you got all this.
Sure.
There's all this other sort of territorialism that's happening. That
Right.
I can feel it in myself, and I don't like it, but I understand it.
Right, and so I'm in a position, like my life is built on leaving places that, or whatever, going in the new place, the next best place. And our neighborhood in Denver, where we could afford to live, was, and we were probably second wave gentrification, and walking the dog. It was one of the most diverse neighborhoods I ever lived in. It was fantastic in so many ways, but you do have this feeling like I'm displacing probably a family of color by being here. So, and that's a huge problem in cities as well. So what do? Do you just leave, or do you stay there, or how do you're displacing someone no matter where you go. And so now it's like, it's a sort of, it's a non-racial gentrification of some places like Missoula, Bozeman, probably people, you would even say Portland and Bend, a few years ago. Right. So you're always putting somebody out. So like, what's my option? Do I move back to Iowa? And then people say, oh, you came back, huh? And a few people are going to be like, well, what happened? Did you fail? Or so you're kind of like, okay, where do we want to go? Make people mad at us. But I haven't experienced a ton of that, but I know it's here. And I know that, I know that people in Montana, Idaho, Washington, Oregon, many states have, always not been psyched on Californians moving here for probably, 50 years, and in Colorado, I used to jokingly call it Texism, where people would not like Texans, moving to Crested Butte or having summer homes there or whatever. So there's always that sort of outside influence. So I shouldn't keep talking about it because
well, it's just sort of a constant. I mean, I think we all just sort of develop an identification with our tribe. And define that however it's pragmatic, whether it's Missoula or Montana or the Rattlesnake or the West Side or whatever. And once you're in it, you sort of feel like you have ownership of it. And, some of those sort of effects are well grounded in social psych. It's just kind of the way we operate. That's not to say we should still operate that way.
One of my favorite sayings I've ever heard, I don't know who said this, but this place started going to shit 15 minutes after I got here.
Exactly.
And I think about that a lot, but
it's like, what is it, that Groucho Marx quote?
I would never be a member of any club that would have me as a member or something like that.
Exactly. Yeah.
No, but it's like people who live here know what an amazing place it is. And I think being conscious to be here, not make it a worse place, and eventually make it a better place, but in a way that is not feeling like an outsider trying to change things. Like, why don't you have more yoga studios, or whatever. Like learning to be a part of the community in a positive way, and helping move it forward, but not sort of bringing what your idea of a city should be to a city that doesn't want it, or
right.
Like has much better things to offer that you can't see because you have blinders on. So if that makes any sense.
It does. So speaking of that, in our last few minutes, I want to sort of get a sense for what's next for you. You write a lot about the importance of the grind and the importance of sort of just doing the work, of figuring out how to get inspired. How do you stay inspired, and what's inspiring you? Like what's kind of the next thing, and how is that connected to what you've been doing?
Yeah. I mean, most of the times the inspiration is not wanting to get a real job. So
that's good inspiration. I've been trying to avoid that for as long as I can remember.
Well, congratulations. I mean, I think, you start to think about where your best stuff comes from, and it's not like, hey, this will sell or this will get clicks. It's more like, especially this year for sure, like people need something, and you're trying to guess what that is. And I think some weeks I believe people could use a good laugh that's not a joke about coronavirus, where you can help them escape for a few minutes about thinking about something else that's quote unquote normal, as opposed to like more jokes about quarantine or lockdown or whatever, that takes you out of that news cycle for a minute, or just inspiring people to do something that they may not have considered before. So I think a lot about along those lines, and I always try to grasp the universality. I don't know if that's a word. I'm a writer. I should know that.
Sounds good to me.
What's universal about our experience? Because I don't think my life is interesting enough to warrant just blabbing on about it and what's happening to me. You can use those stories as an entry point to talk about things like, why do we travel, or what are we looking for? Why does this make us happy? Why does this not make us happy? So trying to tap into that and try to figure out what people need, I guess. And your metric is how many people, read your stuff, and you can see that, or tap, the like button on Instagram. So one of the biggest posts I've had this year was about, it was a very long illustrated post about anxiety and how I've been trying to work on that or not work on it. And I feel like that's just sort of the feeling of our times. I don't know if it's 2020 or generally in the last 5 years, but I feel like a lot of people are dealing with that stuff. And I don't personally see it as being like super brave for me to talk about. It doesn't feel uncomfortable, but I think a lot of people don't see people talking about those things. And it's when you do talk about it, it gives them comfort to feel like they're not alone, which if you can make one person feel less alone with your week, I think that's a pretty good way to make a living, and a pretty good way to spend your time. And if you can make 100 people feel less alone, that's even better.
Even better. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Brendan, that's an inspiration. Thank you for that work, for the attitude you bring to it. Thanks for being a part of Missoula. I'm excited to meet you in person someday. It's been fun learning more about your work. And thanks for coming on the podcast and sharing your story.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Justin.
Thanks for listening to A New Angle. We really appreciate it. A New Angle is underwritten by First Security Bank and Blackfoot, with support from the University of Montana College of Business and Consolidated Electrical Distributors. AJ Williams is our producer. Jeff Ament, John Wicks, and VTO made our music, and Jeff Meese is our master of all things sound. If you have any questions, suggestions, comments, insults, whatever, please email me at anewangle@umontana.edu. If you like what you heard, tell your friends about us. Thanks a lot, and see you next time.